Well, the background was that the federal government started to want to walk away from residential schools in the 40s and 50s. They were recognizing that there were huge problems and huge issues, and plus it wasn't achieving the objective they had in mind, which was really the whole assimilative agenda that they had for Aboriginal people. So in 1951 they created an amendment to the Indian Act called the Laws of General Application. And this meant that the Indian people living on reserves were subject to provincial laws. And this meant that the Child Welfare Act was then applicable to Aboriginal people living on First Nations reserves. So it took about 10 years before the province really started to have an expanded system of regional offices that were near the reserves where they could even access a lot of the families and children. Didn't understand the culture, didn't understand traditional ways of parenting, didn't understand the conditions, and who were poorly trained. And at the time, most of us were not social workers. We were with all kinds of backgrounds. So a lot of ignorance, and you have to recognize that we were now coming into communities where all of the parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had been raised in residential schools. And we didn't understand that part of the history either. So we didn't know what we were doing. The marvel of it sometimes is that we didn't do more damage, I think. And that's probably a credit to people who use their judgment and insight and so on. But, it wasn't until about 1972 or 3 when the meeting of deputy ministers that I saw the minutes of, where Alberta all of a sudden realized that they had 1,200 or 1,300 Aboriginal children in care. And deputy minister says, whoa, what's going on here? And it became alarmed at the numbers and the trends. And they started trying to reverse it. And it took about 10 years before we reached the point of having kind of formal delegated agreements and an understanding in a new piece of child welfare legislation to try to begin reversing this trend, to apply principles where the Aboriginal communities could have their own authority to deliver child welfare services. And it was then that the legislation made it mandatory to consult with First Nations and to work more closely with chiefs and councils and to develop some protocols about, using Aboriginal communities and resources and families as a first and primary resource, as opposed to just automatically assuming there was nothing there and taking the children and placing them in the white foster care or institutions. So that was kind of the beginning of this delegated agreement, set of agreements. And it moved us down to a point where I think every band now, out of 44 bands, has an agreement of some type. But part of my theme has been that in some cases all this means is we've overlaid a white system on an Aboriginal system that is already pretty dysfunctional. And in some cases we're asking Aboriginal people to deliver a foreign system. So putting them in a real quandary and putting their communities in a quandary, and it's created a lot of unintended consequences, most of which are more and more children being lost. That wasn't the intention, but that's essentially the outcome. It's definitely a factor in the prairies. I don't know if the same phenomenon occurred in Ontario or Quebec. I don't think, not to the same extent. But I think it's primarily a prairie phenomenon. So what we're doing now is really opening a door that I don't think anybody has really opened yet in this country. And that's taking a look and really acknowledging and recognizing their experience and beginning to talk about what we need to do to avoid a replication. And there's been a lot of improvements in the child welfare system, but as you can see from what people are saying, at some fundamental levels, there's been no change. That's been the whole assumption beneath this research here, is that because we're not changing the way we're looking at situations, and because we keep relying on very hierarchical, bureaucratic processes and very procedural, processes rather than looking at the heart of the matter. And the outcomes for kids and families are not getting much better. In fact, they're getting worse in some places. Not all. I mean, some communities are making a valiant effort to find better ways, but they have a lot of strikes against them. The federal government is not giving them the funds to take a different approach. They're fighting them to take children away. The province is not giving them any slack. They're making them follow the legislation, and they're also insisting on following very detailed provincial standards that don't work for them. So when people here say that it's not working for you, why should it work for us? I think they're right. And when they say we need more autonomy to do what we need to do, I think they're right. Whether people are willing to give them that autonomy or turn it over is a whole other question. And I think they'll have to fight for every single inch of it, because nobody will give it freely. Sturgeon Lake, I think, entered into an agreement in about the mid-80s. At the time, they were part of the Lesser Slave Lake Indian Regional Council. There were 7 bands that had pooled their resources and developed a child welfare system that included Sturgeon Lake and 6 other bands around this area. A few years ago, I'm not sure, maybe 3 years ago or so, they broke away from the Lesser Slave Lake Indian Regional Council and formed something called the Western Cree, which has 3 bands in it. So they now have another child welfare agency that is responsible for those 3 bands, and they then have, this is a small community, so they have 1 worker for this community that tries to do pretty well everything. It's not a huge population. The band population is about 1,600 people. About 800 actually live at Sturgeon Lake. But I do know anecdotally that it's been a very tough role for the workers to play here, not just for the caseload, but the community dynamics and politics and a whole lot of other things going on. I had spoken to one of the workers who had been here, who's since resigned, and I saw him he came for a couple of days today for this conference, and he's agreed to come down and see me in Edmonton to talk about his experience. But he did participate in a session a number of months ago, and he was quite candid about his frustration about trying to do social work and to meet the needs of his people in this kind of environment. And he is fed up with social work and child welfare and wants to go drive a truck. And that was, he had a BSW, he'd gotten a BSW from us, and was well trained, I think had a good heart and had the right intentions, but was totally thwarted and frustrated. And, the question is how do you sustain that sense of more optimism and more hope? And this is one of the reasons I was trying to see if we could reach a fairly concrete level of creating vision and possibility. And it's a process, right? I mean, we have to. This is one of the reasons why I really like the idea of film, because I think it's a far more powerful medium than writing reports that people don't read and giving conference presentations that don't reach the people that you want to reach. And it's very basic. I think capacity development and capacity building. The people that are here, I've seen a lot of the same people keep coming back. Over residential schools, and they come for a while, then they stop, and then they come back, and it's very discouraging, I think, for them to. But at the same time, creating some element of hope or possibility, I think, is one of the best things we can do. When it was set up in the residential schools, it wasn't even subtle. I looked at the early documents. The documents were very clear, the policy documents, by superintendents and politicians. Our objective is to wipe the Indian people off the face of this country. We want to make them disappear. That is clearly our objective. The residential schools were set up with that objective. We can't change the parents, but we can change the children if we remove them from the influence of their parents. It was a very deliberate planned strategy. I looked at documents that compared what they were trying to do here with what had been done in Africa. And they say, let's learn from our experience in Africa, and that's how they planned the policy. I mean, it was very deliberate. There was nothing anybody could say that was done out of ignorance. It was a deliberate attempt, a very deliberate, thoughtful attempt. The historical context was we worked collaboratively with Aboriginal people as long as they were useful to us. And then when they weren't, we pushed them out of the way, and we needed their land, and they were of little consequence. When I was in school at social work, I never heard about residential schools. I mean, this was in Ottawa, so it was just never even came up. It wasn't talked about. I mean, it's been buried. It only really came out when, when the Phil Fontaine and some of these folks had come out with the fact that they were abused in residential schools. And that began to encourage people to start to talk about this, and people began to reveal their own abuses, and then it became like the floodgates of everybody coming out and saying, yeah, this is what it was like. And it's when people began to call attention to it. And the ultimate outcome with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People and the recommendation to spend, $8 billion or something to address all the issues, and the ultimate commitment was $350 million spread across the country. Talk about a slap in the face in terms of recognition of all the damages that were done and the pittance that's being offered to people to begin to address the serious social issues and consequences. One thing I found when I was doing that review and look at the historical factors around residential schools and children's services and so on, is that it almost invariably, it seems to have taken about 20 years from the time an idea was first being tossed around and people were beginning to explore it and look at it, until it actually became part of the way things were being done. It was. There seems to be a cycle that people have to go through somehow, and anything that's got any sense of being very different. People are far stronger and more forceful and articulate in their expression of a need for a much higher level of self-determination, of deciding what it is that needs to be done, and not being constrained by other governments, other levels of government. And plus, people are being a lot more open about their dissatisfaction with current leadership and their unwillingness to really share power and control and to recognize what people are saying. So it's taking place. It's, I think we will see a difference. And I think what augurs well is the numbers of Aboriginal people who are getting a higher education. I think the numbers are increasing all the time. I think people are really smart. I think the people in themselves have a huge degree of resilience and have shown how tenacious they can be at hanging on to their beliefs and their traditions. And I think ultimately, they're going to help us. I mean what I say when I talk about Aboriginal people, giving us permission to talk about spirituality and relationship and connection and identity, because we don't talk about it in our normal discourse as white people. It's a taboo subject, spirituality, and they bring us back to it in many different forms. And by doing that, they're going to help us find a way out of this rut